there's only one line in the Bible where you have synesthesia. And the line goes like this. And all the people are seeing the voices and the flames and the sound of the trumpet. Now, you don't normally see voices, and you don't normally see the sounds of the trumpet unless you've taken some acid. That line comes from the only collective vision in the Bible. With this particular scene, it's when all of the Israelites are eating manna, and it's when Moses goes up on the mountain and he does his thing, and then all of the Israelites together, they all have this experience of synesthesia.
So, let's start on this hay fevery day. Today I have with me Danny Nemu. Danny is a friend, and he's a very, very special person who is an author of a couple of incredibly excellent books. And he's a hypnotist, he's an eschatologist, he's a researcher of language, the Bible, drugs in the Bible, spontaneous scientific discoveries, and many, many other things. So, where to start with, Danny? I would like to talk about the Bible. So let's start in the beginning. In the beginning, we have Genesis 1:1. What's the line? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Is that right?
That's definitely one way of translating that line, and it's a very popular way. There was a sage, the name of him is Nachmanides, the Ramban, and he's one of the greatest sages of Jewish history. And he made a comment that the Bible was written in black fire on white fire. And when it was written without spaces. And when you divide it up in different ways, it reveals different secrets, different names of God.
So Hebrew today has spaces, right? So this is a different language? Is it not Hebrew? What was it?
Yeah, so the Bible was originally written in Paleo-Hebrew. And in many ancient languages, including Greek, they didn't write with spaces. And so now when we look at the Torah, it does have spaces. But if you look at really early inscriptions in the language that came before Hebrew, they don't have spaces. And this is a kind of comment on the way the letters came down from God, let's say. So Nachmanides says that if you divide it up differently, it reveals different secrets. So the first couple of words of the Bible in the beginning are divided up like this: Bereshit bara Elohim. Bereshit means in the beginning, or in beginning, or with wisdom as well. It can mean a lot of different things. Bara is to create, and Elohim is God. If you take and this is the example that Nachmanides gives, if you take the last two letters from the first word, which is Yod and Tav, and you put them on the next word, rather than it being Bereshit bara, it becomes Barosh Yitbara. And the vowel changes as well. So it's Bereshit, and that goes to Barosh. Barosh means in the head, right? Rosh is head in Hebrew. Yitbara makes that word create passive. So in the head is created God. Or in the head was created God, or even in the head will be created God, because the tenses work differently in Hebrew. So he begins the text like that. He says, if you look at the first line and you move the letters around a little bit, or you move the spaces, you break up those lines a bit differently. It can mean in the head is created. And then the word Elohim is an interesting one. It is both plural and singular. The grammar around it is singular, and we translate it as God normally, but Elohim, im, is a masculine plural. So when Jews say l'chaim, cheers, it means to life. So that's not plural, but it's abstract, right? So when you put something in the abstract sense, you put it in the plural. So that word is both plural and singular, and also abstract. And also another thing that's interesting about that word is that El means power, and Elim means powers. When you put a letter He, letter Ha, Elohim, Ha is a feminine letter. Like words like Deborah and Hannah, they end in that letter because they're feminine names. Or Deborah, it means bee as well. Debar is the masculine. That means word. That's a whole other interesting story. But so that word is both masculine and feminine, and plural and singular as well. So it means a lot of things. You might translate it as powers. In the head are created the powers. And then if you do something similar with the rest of the line, which normally says, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, if you move, so that et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, if you move the hey again from et hashamayim to ata shamayim, ata means you. So that line will mean, in the head are created the powers, or the gods, or God. You are heavens and you are earth, which is a really interesting way to begin the Bible and to begin a book which has all kinds of stories of altered perception and the kind of thing that we might associate with mystical experience or even psychiatric experience that was viewed through a different lens back in the day.
But you're talking about moving vowels around, and you're talking about moving the spaces around. The spaces we have the liberty to move around because we know the spaces didn't exist in the original text, and then some later author imposed them, right? When it was translated from Paleo-Hebrew to modern Hebrew. However, the vowels, what's the story there?
So the vowels, you don't write the vowels in Hebrew. So in the Torah, in the original Hebrew text, there aren't any vowels. Or rather, there's an aleph, which is the open-mouthed sound. And it can be ah, or in Elohim, it's eh. And in the word, for example, aleph, it's ah. So it can be pronounced a lot of different ways, that one. The dots that you see in Hebrew underneath the line, and in other places, they came in much later in history. They came in with the Masoretes, who codified exactly how you're meant to pronounce the Bible. So, for example, there's this wonderful word, aurum and aurom, right? It's the end of Genesis 2. The line goes like this. It goes, and the man and the woman were naked and they were not ashamed. And the word naked there is written in exactly the same letters as a word in the following line. And the following line is, and the snake was more subtle than any of the creatures that Yahweh Elohim created. That word subtle and that word naked are written in exactly the same way, the same letters. One of those is pronounced aurum, and one of those is pronounced aurom. And the way it's pronounced is completely different. So when we think about the word subtle, it's actually the only adjective which the snake is given in the entire book of Genesis, or in fact the entire Bible. We have an idea that the snake is evil, but it doesn't call him evil, it calls him subtle. But it could also be read as naked. And it could also be read as prudent, because the same word means prudent. So when, for example, Yahweh Elohim says to Adam, after they've eaten the fruit, he goes off and he hides. And Yahweh Elohim says to him, why are you hiding? And he says, in the translation we read, I'm hiding because I'm naked. He could be saying, I hid because I was prudent. And then if you look elsewhere in the Bible, for example, in Proverbs, you get that same word, aurum, aurom. And if I remember rightly, it's written about 8 times. And every time it's a virtue. So you get, for example, lines which say, the prudent man sees the danger and hides. I might be getting the words a little bit wrong there. But that's the same word, prudent. So that word, aurum, aurom, is normally a virtue. But when it's applied to the snake, in translation, we tend to read it as a vice, as a bad thing about the snake.
Okay, so those different ways of translating that same word came through the Masoretes who later, is that correct?
The Masoretes decided to set the pronunciation of the text, and they set it according to certain rules. And one of the rules was nothing could be said bad about God or Yahweh, right? And there were other things that were codified as the way that you were allowed to pronounce it. But before that, and in fact, you still have, for example, the Orthodox churches, the Eastern Orthodox churches, some of the lines of the Bible which they have are different from the Hebrew Names Version and the King James Version, for example, because they're working from a different tradition of pronunciation of those words. So in the context of, when it was originally used, which was basically the different sections would be read out in different weeks, and the rabbis would be talking to their communities. So on a given week, maybe something had happened. So it would be more appropriate to read the text in a certain way that would elucidate that story a little bit better. So it's a very responsive text. And what's really interesting about that is that when you look at the world in different ways, and in fact, thinking of psychedelics, when you break up When you break up the world in other ways, it reveals different secrets. For example, I might think my wife's a nightmare, and then I might take a big dose of acid or ayahuasca, and the edges dissolve. And rather than thinking my wife's a nightmare, I might put the edge in a slightly different place. I might say, right, together the two of us are a nightmare. And then there's other kind of solutions that you can approach that problem with, you know. So one of the things that psychedelics do are they change where we see the edges.
So you're talking about psychedelics breaking up perception, and you're also talking about how the Bible can be broken up into many, many different ways, and the way it's been broken up and the way our whole civilization has been founded through Christian ideals that were decided a very long time ago when they chose very particular translations from the Bible. Are you saying necessarily that the translations they chose are wrong, or just hey, here's another way of looking at it? Or I mean, with it having no spaces, Paleo-Hebrew having no spaces, when they read it, was there a correct translation, or were they supposed to have many different multi-layers of meanings within the question, within the readings?
Something that's said about the Bible is that when it is translated, it was first translated into Greek in about 200 BC, I believe it was. Septuagint is the name of the text. And there's a couple of legends about when it's translated. And one of them is that it was given to 72 scholars, and they all miraculously produced the same translation. And the other legend is that the sun went out for 3 days. The rabbis describe the Bible in translation as a lion in a cage. A lion in a cage. So think about all that power, but it's locked up, because the beauty of that book is in the poetic flexibility of it. And I'll give you an example. So we already talked about the lion, and the snake was more subtle than any of the creatures that Yahweh Elohim had made, right? That line doesn't say that Yahweh Elohim doesn't say whether he made the snake or not, right? It implies, from a certain way of looking at it, that maybe the snake was there beforehand. Or another line would be when Adam and Eve are thinking about eating the fruit. Now he will become like us, at knowing good and evil. It's not clear from the Hebrew whether it's he shall be like the gods, knowing good and evil, or he should be like the gods, but unlike the gods, they will know good and evil, right? So then you look into the text and look into other correspondence throughout this incredible book, and well, what does it mean to know good and evil? Well, for example, to tell lies might be considered bad. So we look at the text and we look at that same story. Who tells the lie in that story? Well, Yahweh Elohim. He says, on the day that you eat that fruit, you will surely die. And the snake says, you will not surely die, right? So who's telling the truth there? It's the snake. Yeah, and he's described as prudent, or subtle, or naked. And just to come back to that idea of naked, when Adam and Eve are described as naked, it's pointing out how innocent they are. They were naked and they were not ashamed, you know. So it opens up a vista of thought where you can then go and discuss the text and think about that text, and that text evolves. You know, the Tao Te Ching is similar, actually. When you first read the Tao Te Ching, it's like quite a lot. This is like, what's all that about? And then life happens, and you think, oh, I see what that means now, right? That's the beauty of that text. When it gets translated into Greek, which is a very differently constructed language, it's much more clear what things mean in Greek. They either mean this or they mean that. And in fact, that's one of Aristotle's laws of thought, is that something can either mean this or that. It can't mean both. Now, that's not the case in Hebrew. It can be both prudent and naked and subtle, all at the same time.
I think there was another line in there that was quite interesting about how God, supposedly the omniscient God, didn't know where Adam went when Adam hid from him, which is...
Yeah, so the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God is not the type of God that's in any of the early books of the Bible, really. Like there's this line where the Israelites are fighting with some of the tribes in the Holy Land, and it says, I forget the name of which tribes it was in particular, but it says they managed to defeat one tribe, but they couldn't defeat this because Yahweh was with them, but they couldn't defeat this other tribe because they had iron chariots. That's not an example of being omnipotent. So, Yahweh was, back in the day, he was a tribal god. And when tribes fight, one of them wins and one of them loses. So you kind of want your god to win. But the idea of an omnipotent, omnipotent god is, from my perspective, it's a Zoroastrian idea. Because what happens, fast forward into history, they've taken the Holy Land, they've lived there for a time, and then along come the Babylonians with Marduk, and they destroy the temple. It doesn't do to say that our God is the most powerful God anymore. So they're in a position where they can say, well, okay, Marduk is more powerful than our God. Or maybe we can say that actually all these gods are kind of one God. So this is what happens. They get exiled off to Babylon. And then I think it's 60 years later or so, the Babylonians are conquered by what becomes the Persian Empire. And they have a Zoroastrian bent to their religion. And then along comes, is it Darius or Cyrus? I forget which one, who says to the Israelites, your God Yahweh is the same as our God, who's the Zoroastrian God. And that's a very different system. You have like a good guy, and you have a bad guy, and you have a kind of catastrophic fight at the end of the world, and all of that kind of end of the world stuff. You don't have anything about the end of the world in the early books of the Bible. You don't have anything about omnipotence. You don't have anything about... And this idea of an evil God as well, like I just mentioned there, the snake is... You don't have to read subtle or prudent or naked as evil. And even, for example, the figure of Satan, Shaitan, in the book of Job, he is given permission by Yahweh to go and test Job. And through the testing that the enemy, his name is the enemy, right? Satan. Job kind of proves himself, and he gets rewarded. He gets his stuff doubled, and he gets a new family. All this stuff that's been taken away from him gets given back and gets doubled. So when the idea of the enemy is not necessarily, or in fact not at all, the enemy of God, but he's the enemy of humans who's under the command of God to get stuff done in the world. And when I say God, I'm talking about the tribal God there, Yahweh.
So what's your take on what Yahweh was, or perhaps is? I mean, you probably heard Mauro Biglino's take that he's an Elohim, and these Elohim were some sort of perhaps superior race of technologically advanced beings, perhaps genetically different, but they ruled and people followed them, and then they sort of kind of disappeared, or may still exist. What's your take on all of that?
I think that Biglino's story is very interesting, and he clearly knows his stuff. I get the feeling that he's trying to find out what the Bible actually means, trying to find the correct translation. And I think it's, I don't think it's that kind of book. It's like trying to understand what the correct shape of the universe is. There's lots of different ways of looking at it. I think it's deliberately poetic and flexible so we can talk about it and we can deepen our understanding. So personally, my way of looking at the Bible, and this is not the only way, obviously, Yahweh to me seems to be he is the tribal God. He reveals his name first to Moses. Before that, when Abraham, for example, doesn't meet Yahweh, he meets El Shaddai. And El Shaddai's behavior is quite different to Yahweh. He is interested. What does he promise to Abraham? He promises that his descendants will be very numerous, for example, and they will take lots of territories. And that's any reptile would be down with that, increasing your territory and having lots of offspring. When you get to Yahweh, he's different. He says he's the God of love. He's the God of war as well, but he's the God of love. He asks that you love your tribe and that you hate other tribes. The things that he promises Moses are different. He promises that they will take land off other tribes, and he mentions the names of other tribes as well. Personally, I think that and we're going right in here into some pretty weird stuff, but different levels of the brain are represented, is one way of looking at it, represented by different God names. So El Shaddai, for me, is the reptilian part of the brain that's interested in territory and reproducing.
Are you suggesting that the biblical representation of El Shaddai was a metaphor for a part of the brain, or are you suggesting that he's somehow synchronously similar to that energy that part of the brain deals with?
Yeah, it's well, Elohim. Elohim means the powers, the drives. Yeah, one of the drives in our brains, in our persons, is that drive to take territory and to reproduce. Another one of those drives is brotherly love. Yeah, and sometimes they come into conflict. When your brother has got something that you want, the reptilian part of you might say, "Well, take it," but the brotherly love part of you might say, "No." Love your brother as yourself, or love your neighbor as yourself, as a later Jew put it, who's Jesus, obviously. For me, the figure of Yahweh is the forces that come from the limbic system, the forces of love, the forces of hate, and particularly with if we were looking at chemicals here, we might talk about oxytocin. Everyone thinks about oxytocin as that which makes you love, and it does. You get loved up, and oxytocin is involved. There's some really interesting research from Holland on the what's the name of the dilemma when you have a railway, a train,
the trolley problem.
The trolley problem, exactly. Like, are you going to change the direction of a train so it runs over
one person,
or are you going to leave it to run over a bunch of people? Now, if you give someone a shot of oxytocin, give a Dutch person a shot of oxytocin, and then you ask him that question, and the person that's going to get killed has a foreign name like Ahmed, they're more likely to run over that guy. And that's what the study revealed. So that thing about oxytocin making you love your own and also hate the other is the dark side of oxytocin, and you get that with Yahweh as well. He's very much about hating your enemies.
But then again, back to my question, are you suggesting that the whole biblical story is an allegory for forces in the brain, or are you saying that these energies actually existed at that time and took the form of some dude called Yahweh or something along those lines?
Yeah, I don't read it as a story of, Abraham lived for many centuries and there were these guys called Elohim.
So it's not a historical document for you, it's more of a fantastical metaphor for the brain, is
it? Yes, but I would like to say that it's also a very inspired document, right? And so, for example, the reason I'm not calling it a metaphor is because I think that it arises out of a source, and so does the brain arises out of a source. I think that there are forces in the universe which express themselves through our brains, through different parts of our brains, but they also express themselves in meteorology. They also express themselves in different aspects of the physical universe as well. So I don't think so much, actually, in the same way as Greek gods. The Greek gods map very beautifully onto psychological processes, and this was the genius of Jung, for example, to find out all of these different ways that you can think about how Aphrodite and Mars and all these different cats interact with each other, illuminate aspects of how we think. But I don't think it's as simple as saying there were some really clever Greek psychologists who said, okay, we're going to represent these as gods. No, I think that these stories arise out of oral traditions, and perhaps they stick around because they speak to internal truths. Like, for example, so in the construction of the Bible, you've got at least, so this is a documentary theory, this is one way of looking about how the Bible was written, you've got at least 4 different documents. They're called the Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly, and the Deuteronomist. And one of those seems to arise around the time of, probably around the time of King David. So you had all these, let's say, minstrels moving around this emerging culture, which was later called the Israelites. And we know that the Israelites, the first kind of physical evidence of something like the Israelites is that pork bones go out of the archaeological record. I think it's like 14th century BC, around then. and you get like a kind of movement away from the mega cities of Canaan into these kind of hilltop villages. It looks like the cities are in decline, much like they are at the moment, and people are fleeing for the hills. And in order to have some kind of coherence amongst their tribes, you had the 12 tribes, for example, and they're united into some kind of a commonwealth. And with the commonwealth, you can, you're much stronger if you can, against like individual tribal wars, and you can kind of expand, and that culture expands. But there is a unifying story there. So the minstrels that were moving around with this and taking stories from here and there, taking stories of a guy who took his son up a hill and was thinking about sacrificing him but then didn't, and all these other stories, for example, they all got woven together into these kind of oral history stories. And, someone will continue to tell a story for thousands of years, hundreds of years, because it speaks to some kind of truth, because it speaks to some level which is very, very important to us, which is why, the hero's journey, for example, would be one of those stories, and you see it popping up in everywhere, from Jesus Christ to Clint Eastwood.
Every Hollywood film follows the script 100%.
Yeah, because it means something. It's meaningful. So the idea of, take that example. You've got Abraham gets told, go up that mountain and sacrifice your son, and off he goes, and he gets to the top, and he's about to kill him, and the angel of Yahweh, and he's told that by El Shaddai, right? And he gets to the top, and Yahweh says, don't kill your son, right? So now he's got two gods.
Is El Shaddai not Yahweh? He's a different god?
Different guy, yeah.
Is that your interpretation, or everyone believes that?
That's in the book, It says, when Yahweh even says, I first revealed myself to Moses, and it even says, Abraham didn't know me by my name of Yahweh. And when Moses says, what's your name? He says, I am. Or I am that I am. I am that I am, but you can call me I am to your friends, So you have this... what I would say reptilian god saying sacrifice your son. And by the way, like creatures which don't have limbic systems like scorpions and snakes, they'll quite often eat their children. When a scorpion's born, it has to quickly jump on its mother's back so she doesn't eat it. If you've ever seen like a gecko, when a gecko gives birth, it doesn't even look at its child. Snakes will eat their young. Mammals very rarely eat their young. So there's this, I'd say, limbic part of the brain, this familial love part of the brain, which kicks in and says, no, don't sacrifice your son. Another reason why I think that Yahweh is particularly pertains to that is because the taboo that he gives. So there's a covenant made between El Shaddai and Abraham, which is that you will circumcise your son and you'll circumcise all your menfolk, right? So it's about your cock, and that's obviously a symbol of power, which is what the reptilian brain is all about, and dominance. And then with Yahweh, it's not. It says you shouldn't boil a kid in its mother's milk. So it's highlighting the sacred nature of the mother-child bond. And like I say, snakes and reptiles don't really have that.
Okay, a couple of questions. One, the reading of the Bible. So we had the Paleo Hebrew when they didn't have spaces. We had the oral traditions where they were reading it out. Just to clarify, all of this stuff, whether they were sacrificing children or not, and just all of the stories in the Bible, how flexible, how different a book could we be looking at if they're translating it differently? Now you're talking about adun, and it could be naked, it could be prudent, it could be sutil. We have words like hit, hot, and hat. I mean, they all sound the same, but except the vowel is different. Is Hebrew that flexible that the whole story could be completely different if it was translated differently, or is it basically the same but just a few details are in question?
Well, it can't mean anything. It's certainly within certain limits of what the what the letters offer you. But yeah, no, profoundly different. It's a bit like. When I was looking for a website, I was looking for a name for the website. Was I going to be hypnotherapy or hypnotherapist? And if you break up the word hypnotherapist wrong, you get hypno the rapist, right? So it's profoundly different, right? It's not like but it's not referring to elephants or something that's completely, so it can't mean anything, but it can mean something absolutely different when you break it up differently, when you vowel it differently, yeah.
So, then the Bible could be translated in a very different way. So another question is, why should we care about any of this? I mean, the Bible is very much losing relevancy. I probably know 3 Christians, maybe, and I know a lot of people. And, the number of people who care about this is receding. Why should we care? Why should we, be interested in this? Why are you interested in it? Why is it important to you that you've spent so much of your time and energy learning about this and becoming familiar with it?
Personally, I became fascinated with it because, for a bunch of reasons, really. To answer your first question, why should we care? I don't think it's really that important. If people don't care, it's really not a big deal. I think the mistranslations are more important than the actual translation politically. So, for example, there's a very, let's say, Christian idea that you should turn the other cheek. Yeah, even if you're not particularly religious, when people get upset, I might think of, David Nutt, for example, gets upset with the government. What does he do? He resigns, right? Yeah, nice.
I thought he was fired. Did he resign?
No, I think he resigned.
Okay.
I may be wrong about that, but I think he resigned. But, in government, often people will, when they get upset, I'm so upset about this, I'm going to resign, which is a very kind of Christy thing to do, isn't it? Like, I don't think the Islamic tradition encourages people to resign when they're unhappy about something. So these things have leaked into our culture in a very, in a way that's still relevant, right? We still live in a sexist culture, and the roots of that sexism go back to, the justification for that sexism was that Eve was weak and she opened the door to sin and let sin into the world, right? And that was just normal Western philosophy for a long time, and it's still lingering here, right? People will look into the Bible and they'll say things that, like, for example, the woman was made out of the man's rib, Adam's rib, story that everyone knows. It's not actually true. If you look in that line, there is no mention of the word rib. The word is tsela. It doesn't mean rib. Where you find the word rib in the Bible, when someone gets stabbed, it says it was, he was stabbed between the I think the 5th and the 6th. The word rib is implied, right? So the only place where that word tsela is translated as rib is in that story. Yeah. What does it actually mean? Well, it can mean the flank of an army, i.e. the half of an army, or it can mean the chamber of a house. Yeah, and a chamber could be half of a house. Yeah. So the idea of the man being divided into two, or not even the man, the human being divided into two, and one of them becoming female and one of them becoming male, is a very different idea to a rib being plucked out of somebody and then it's less demeaning to women. Another example of that would be, as I mentioned before, Elohim being both masculine and feminine. Another example would the way that, for example, Noah is called she in the Bible in certain situations. Eve is called he. These things are much, much more fluid. So it's kind of, in a way, if you're looking to undermine some of the abuses of the modern order, that have been handed down to us on the foundation of a mistranslation of the Bible, I think that's quite interesting from a kind of subversive perspective. And just one other thing on that, the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth. So that comes from the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament as well.
Matthew 5:5, right?
Yeah, but it's also in the Old Testament. And another way of translating that would be, like, for example, meek is anav in Hebrew. Yeah, very rarely means, in fact, it doesn't mean meek. Moses is described as the meekest person on all the face of the earth, right? Now, Moses gets angry when his tribe doesn't completely wipe out their enemies. Why have you left the children alive? That's not very meek. He challenges Pharaoh. That's not what we associate with meekness. It might mean meek in the face of the will of God. So he does what God says, Yahweh says, right? Meek normally means poor. Yeah, Yarash which is inherit, isn't it? Almost never translated as inherit, and normally translated as seize. Yeah, and earth, we think of the earth. The old ancient Israelites didn't have a concept of the earth. They had a concept of their country, and the Scythians over there, and the Egyptians over there, and the Babylonians over there. And they didn't know about the other side of the world. They didn't know about any of that stuff. It's the same with Noah's flood. The idea of a worldwide flood is not in the text. But coming back to this idea of the meek shall inherit the earth, like a much more normal way of translating all of those words, being anav, yarash, and eretz, would be the poor shall seize the land, right? Which is much more in line with my politics. I don't know about yours, but the Christian legacy in our culture is to turn the other cheek, to wait patiently for your reward in heaven, and all of that kind of stuff, which is not at all biblical. Certainly not in the Old Testament.
So all of these translations, whether we have Eve screwing up and inviting sin, whether we have meek inheriting the earth or seizing the land, all of these translations were decided by somebody with some sort of agenda. Why do you think they translated it the way they did? Do you think it's because they thought that was the most accurate translation given their knowledge of the story and the text and the context, or was there an agenda? What's your take on this?
Yeah, there was an agenda. There were a series of agendas. And it happens several times. So you have these various documents, and they get put together at various moments in history. So, for example, you've got the Yahwist, you've got the Elohist, which are the original one is the Yahwist, which tells most of the stories that you'll be associated with, like the Exodus and the story of Noah, the story of the Tower of Babel, all those kind of stories. And then you've got the Elohist. And the Elohist happens because, to cut a long story short, after Solomon, his son... Solomon's taxing heavily the northern kingdoms, and his son gets approached after Solomon dies, gets approached by ambassadors from the northern kingdoms and say, can you please lower our tax burden? And he says, no. He's advised to say, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Where he chastises you with whips, I will chastise you with scorpions. And he raises their tax burden. There's a tax revolt. The kingdoms get broken into two, and you have the two countries. You have Judea and you have Israel. These warring kingdoms, and they go to war for 200 years. And everything goes terribly wrong. The northern one gets invaded and overtaken, and then you have a flood of refugees. And then there was this moment where you have these two texts, and they have to find a way of integrating them to keep the two communities together. You then get another layer with the priestly documents, and then you get a layer with Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is interesting. It starts off by saying you can only sacrifice, you have to bring your tithes and your sacrifices to Jerusalem. You can't do it at any other shrines, right? So for all of the history before that, Solomon, for example, has been sacrificing at various different shrines, and you had these kind of local shrines. And like a sacrifice would be this: you take your firstborn of your flock, for example, or you take a certain amount of your wheat or your barley or whatever you were growing, you give a bunch of it to the priest, right? So that would maintain the priest, who would be looking after all your various rituals, performing kind of contractual stuff, also probably... they were herbalists as well, so healing your diseases. Like, think of shaman herbalist priests as well, with all the good and all the bad that you might imagine from dodgy shamans in the jungle as well. That was what that's what the land looked like until the centralization of the cult around Jerusalem. And then they say, no, you can't do that anymore. You have to bring all of your economic wealth to Jerusalem, because we want it here. So you bring it up, you sacrifice it. It basically means you give it to the state. Yeah. So state power is responsible for, I would say, pretty much everything in Deuteronomy. So I'll give you another example of that. If you are a property owner, if you, like, for example, if you have an ox and it gores someone, you're not in trouble. If your ox gores someone twice, then you get in trouble. Yeah. But you're the guy who owns the ox. So it's quite a kind of capitalistic document, the Deuteronomy, which is all the laws. Most of the laws get laid on there, except for the cleanliness laws, which come with the priests, which also increase the priest's powers. Another one which says, if two men are fighting and the wife gets involved and grabs the balls of one of the men, she will not be pitied. I think her hand gets cut off or something like that, right? So the situation where a woman is defending her husband from a man, I mean, that could be many things, but like, Why was that legislated? In the situation of perhaps a bailiff coming and taking your land because you taxed them, and a woman coming in to defend her husband, it's an assault on the family unit, yeah. And I would say in favour of state power against family power. So that's the kind of level of Deuteronomy. Then you got with the translation into English. And let's talk about, say, the King James version, yeah. That was produced at a time when England was at war. You had the Reformation. You had Puritans and Anglicans and Catholics with various kind of different ideas. King James says, I want to have a Bible which is going to be easy to understand and not controversial. So Matthew, for example, he has a line about what's translated as the end of the world. That word in Greek is aeon. Aeon doesn't mean world. Aeon means epoch or age, yeah. And what the Puritans wanted at that time was the end of the monarchy, really, and the introduction of the parliamentary system. So they really wanted the end of the aeon. King James didn't want that. He was the king. So he had that translated as the end of the world, because who wants to imagine the end of the world? So that's an example of a political influence on the translation. And then you've got other things as well. You've got translation, but you've also got interpretation. So everyone knows this line, turn the other cheek. And almost no one knows what it actually means, because the line before it says, if a man slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other also. Yeah, this isn't a translation, but this is a traditional interpretation. If a man strikes you on your right cheek, now if I'm a righty and I'm going to throw a punch, it's going to land on your left cheek, unless I do a spinning back fist or something. In the context of the Roman Empire, which is when those words were written, basically, or when Jesus was telling that story, the strike on your right cheek is a backhander. It's a slap with the back of your hand. And that's how men discipline their women, it's how fathers discipline their children, and it's how masters discipline their slaves. Yeah, you weren't allowed to beat up your slave for no good reason. You weren't allowed to beat someone in the territories you occupied for no good reason. So if a man strikes you on your right cheek, turn your left cheek, turn the other also. Yeah, it's saying, if you want to hit me, here we are in public, let's go. Yeah. Jesus' stories are extremely intelligent ways of flipping the hierarchy. There's 3 stories in a row there. Another one is about if a man takes your shirt, give him your coat as well. Again, we tend to interpret that as to not resist, but it really doesn't mean that. In the context of Jewish law, your coat is a debtor can take, or a creditor can take off someone who owes him money, everything that he owns, including his coat, but he has to give the coat back at the end of the day because it might be what he has to sleep in, taking his last item. So what Jesus is saying there is, if someone takes your coat, which basically means they've taken your last thing, that's how much of an arsehole they are, give them your shirt as well. And in that time, they wore a kind of tunic thing and an overcoat. That means you walked around naked. Now, in the context of Jewish law, it's not illegal to be naked. It's shameful to look upon nakedness. So if you're walking around naked, you're fine. But the people who have to look at you, who know that people knew each other, they knew that you were owed money, and they knew that your creditor had been so mean as to take your coat off you, that turns that appalling abuse, financial abuse, against the creditor there.
So all of these stories, the way we've been fed them in our translations that we've absorbed since we were children, it's all about empowering the state and, diminishing the individual and the collective people against the state, right? So that seems to be the agenda behind the translations.
Certainly that's how I read it, yeah.
Okay.
And that's one way of reading it. There are other ways of reading it.
So, like you said before, there are many, many ways of reading these texts, and I think the point was that there were many ways of reading them, and you can play with them and tailor your story for the people who are listening as you read the oral tradition, right? So, the other stuff that you've worked on that I find interesting is drugs in the Bible. So that is a controversial topic to some degree. However, when we talk about drugs in the Bible, Are we talking about the entire fantastical stories of interactions with this holy being were all derived from trips, or what's the story of drugs in the Bible going on?
I'm glad you asked that question, because there is a lot of speculation about the fact that all the prophets were tripping, and I don't think there's any reason to think that in most cases. You get prophets who do things which look like yoga in many ways. Some of them practice abstinence of various sorts, whether that's sexual or they don't eat, or they might assume certain kind of positions, a bit like an asana, or they might go to a special magical place. So they do use techniques to get into an altered state. Moses goes up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, in isolation, which is not too far off a dieta in the Amazon. You go off on your own. But particularly about drugs in the Bible, I'm talking about the preparations which were used by the priests, and you find them in Exodus 30. And there's two. One of them is the anointing oil, and one of them is the temple incense. So let's talk about them, because the priests, it was their job and their family lineage to be in contact with Yahweh, be in contact with these powers, and then translate the information, let's say, that they got from these places. So the prophets were different. The prophets came up from various different families, and they are normally kind of railing and complaining about where things are going and how people have given up on God and given up on their ways, and if they continue doing that, things are going to go terribly, terribly wrong for them. So the priests are very much different. They're part of state power, but in any tribal system, traditional tribal system, you have your court astrologers, or you have your jungle shamans, who are, among other things, their political advisors. Yeah? The anointing oil has 4 ingredients in it. It has cinnamon, cassia, myrrh, and then something which is called cannabisem, or cannabis, which seems very likely to be cannabis. And someone who's done a load of research on this is Chris Bennett. The Scythians had reference to cannabis. Herodotus talks about, they called it cannabis, how they throw it on the fire, and they turn down the flaps of their tents to make a hot box, basically, and they throw it on the fire and they jump up and down and start singing. Sounds like a good party. So, we could talk about all the evidence around cannabisem, but it means fragrant cane in Hebrew. But the other ones are even more interesting, I think.
The upshot, though, at cannabisem is that you think it is cannabis.
Yeah, it's called calamus. It's translated as calamus in the Bible, but calamus is like a reed, and we know that this stuff that's mentioned there is used for shirts for the dying. And people have been making clothes, for the dead. Yeah, people have been making clothes for ever out of cannabis. No one's ever made clothes out of calamus. It would degrade in days. It's also used elsewhere in the Talmud. It's got kind of rules on cannabis as well, how to mixing the fibers. So we know that it was used in clothing. You can't use calamus in clothing. But there's lots of other streams of evidence about that. All of the tribes around had something like cannabis around. I can just run through them here. Yeah, so the Scythians called it cannabis, the Greeks called it cannabis, the Persians called it kanab, the Assyrians called it kenab, in Babylon it was kambun, in India it was kana. We also have archaeological evidence of cannabis all over the place, including on Ramses II's mummy, pollen, and that was brought in on the trade routes that came through the Holy Land. There's also, people got very excited about a finding at Tel Arad, which is a temple in the south of Judea, because they found residues of cannabis and frankincense. Right, so frankincense is also mentioned in Exodus 30. It's in one of the other preparations. So just starting,
it's in the anointing oil, or in the other one?
No, it's in the other one. It's in 2 actually. It's in the incense, which is burned in a hot box, which we'll get to in a minute. It's also used in what's called the showbread, which we'll also get to in a minute. There's a lot of frankincense in the Bible. Jesus was into it as well. So the anointing oil itself has cinnamon, which is cinnamomum verum, cassia, which says Cinnamomum cassia, so that's two different strains of cinnamon, and then myrrh and cannabis. By the way, there's dispute about what all these plants are, and without going really deep into the academics of it, you can look at my article, which is called "Getting High with the Most High." That's kind of peer-reviewed journal article. It's very interesting, that mixture, because cinnamon and cassia together inhibit all of the enzymes of the cytochrome system, which are involved in breaking down drugs. Right.
Okay, wait. Before you get into what this stuff does, what context was it used? The anointing oil. So, the priests would put it on what? What were they anointing, and how, and why, and when?
Yeah. When they went into the tabernacle.
And again, this is in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in Exodus. So the Israelites were carrying this holy tent around in the story of the wandering around the wilderness. They're carrying this tent around. Yeah. Back in the day, tents were used for hotboxing. That was how you used fumigants, right? That's how you used smokes, because they didn't introduce the pipe until many centuries later into the area. So that was the equivalent of smoking. The tabernacle was where all of the kind of priestly things went on. So the priest would go in there, and the first thing that would happen was they would be anointed with oil. It's called shemen hamishcha in Hebrew, and mishcha comes from the word masha. Masha means to paint or to wipe in Hebrew. It's the root of our word massage. It looks like it's the root of our word massage through the Arabic and the French to massage. So when we talk about anointing, we're talking about like a massage, and probably an all-over body massage. All of the priests would have the anointing oil, and then the high priest would go off on his own into a deeper chamber of the tabernacle of this tent, where it was said that Yahweh himself dwelled. And he would go in there with handfuls of another preparation, with 16 or so ingredients, crushed into a fine powder. And the only thing that he was allowed to take in there was a censer. So basically, he's going into a small hot box, a chamber about 4.5 meters cubed, super sealed with various skins over the top of it and a thick veil to close it. It would have been an incredibly smoky chamber. I mean, we're talking about handfuls of incense, and that's where the frankincense is. That's the high priest. The other priests didn't have that opportunity. They went and ate the showbread together.
And the showbread contained the same stuff as the anointing oil.
We don't know what the showbread contained. We know it had frankincense with it.
And this recipe for the anointing oil, where did it come from? Like they invented it themselves, or what happened?
That's a very interesting question. It was also found in the Mendesium, which was an oil that was made in Egypt from myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia from the Middle Bronze Age. Well, it was exported from the Middle Bronze Age to Rome. And bear in mind that myrrh doesn't grow in Egypt, so they had a trade in incense going back to probably about 5000 BC, maybe even more. Incenses were the first international commodity, and frankincense particularly is an interesting one because, Petra, for example, was built on the wealth of frankincense. You had a huge trade that went from Hong Kong. Hong Kong means fragrant port because of the incense trade, all the way up to North Africa and Canaan. Frankincense was burned all over the place. But back to this preparation here. Yeah, the Mendesium contains myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia. Those are particularly interesting, right? Myrrh itself contains opioid receptor agonist. It works on the opioid system, opioid receptors rather, and so it works on the same system as opium, heroin, those kind of things. A lot of that is broken down by your enzymes. So people will be familiar with how ayahuasca works, and as one of the ways it works is that the DMT in ayahuasca is not orally available. If you eat it, it gets broken down by your monoamine oxidase enzymes. So if you eat it or if you ingest it along with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, or MAOI, such as harmaline or the beta-carbolines, basically, which is what you find in ayahuasca, the vine ayahuasca, then your enzymes get inhibited. That means the DMT can get into your brain and it can do all kinds of marvelous things. There is more to ayahuasca than that. I wouldn't want it to be quite so simplistic about it, but one of the synergies that's going on is that you have something similar and maybe older, because this is at least 3,000 years old when that was written, and then in Egypt it goes back to the Middle Bronze Age, which is the combination of cinnamon and cassia. So the cytochrome system contains a wide variety. I believe it's 52 different enzymes, and they're involved in breaking down a whole load of things that human beings consume, and 5 of them or so are involved in breaking down the drugs that you consume. Right? They have names. They're the P450 enzymes. They're called, well, one of them is called CYP2D6, CYP3A4, CYP2C9, CYP2E1, and CYP1A2. Not very cool names, so we can probably do better than that. Cinnamon inhibits 4 of those, the last 4 I mentioned there. It doesn't inhibit CYP2D6, but cassia does. Yeah, so cinnamon contains cinnamaldehyde, which is inhibitory to these things. So what I'm saying here is that the anointing oil acts as an inhibitor of the enzymes which would break down drugs going into your body.
Any drugs?
Yeah, any drugs, yeah. Well, 99% of the drugs go. I don't know if it works on salvinorin and strange things like that.
You're talking specifically about psychedelic drugs, though, visionary drugs?
No, all of them, like THC as well. If you take that and then you take THC, I mean, it's not considered a psychedelic, but no, like the opioid receptor agonists as well, like sedatives, things like that. But yeah, also the tryptamines and all those as well.
So it will potentiate the experience, it will potentiate the trip.
It'll potentiate a lot, yeah.
So why isn't everyone doing this? Why isn't everyone taking cinnamon when they smoke and taking cinnamon when they, take ayahuasca or the acid or mushrooms or whatever?
Well, maybe they. So you asked me, why should people be interested in the Bible? The Bible. Maybe there's something to learn in there. There is a group, they call it oilahuasca. So there are people who are researching things like basil and various types of chamomile and stuff like this. I don't know too much about it, but I've got this really interesting quote from someone who was taking, I think this was estradiol. Estradiol is also in, is it in cinnamon? It's definitely in nutmeg, for example. Nutmeg's an interesting one, actually. We'll come back to nutmeg in a minute. He says, wow, this is a much better combo. I felt like I had a warm, fuzzy blanket wrapped around me without CYP2D6 inhibition. But with CYP2D6 inhibition, I feel that I am that warm, fuzzy blanket. Right? So there's a different experience there.
Okay, so what about you got the various enzyme inhibitions from the 2 different types of cinnamon. So then when they take the cannabis, they have a more visionary experience. Cool. What about the frankincense and myrrh? What role do they play in that? Are they also enzyme inhibitors, or are they psychedelic themselves, or what do they do?
Well, there it gets really interesting. So everyone in there takes frankincense. They don't have it in the original oil, but the high priest goes off, and one of the things that he takes is frankincense. One of the things that's in the Ktorat Hasamim, which is the temple incense, is frankincense. And in Exodus 30, it's described like this: you got frankincense, galbanum, onycha, and stacta. Right? Frankincense works on the many systems, in fact, but maybe the most famous of them is the GABA system. So the GABA system is like Valium works on the GABA system, for example. It's considered tranquilizer. I don't like the term so much. You've got to bear in mind that these terms come from a certain historical context. Back in the day, frankincense is called laban, and myrrh is called nataf, and nataf means prophecy. That's what you have in Exodus 30. It describes those 4 things. Galbanum is also a GABA receptor agonist. GABA is an interesting, it's very widely distributed system. It's the most common of the GABAergic system is all over the brain. I think it's something like 40% of the neurons in your brain are GABAergic. That's their neurotransmitter, and every neuron is either GABAergic or the next door neuron is GABAergic.
So the frankincense agitates them, meaning what?
It inhibits. Yeah, so it kind of chills them out. It makes them less likely to fire. But some of those are inhibitory themselves. So, for example, if you've got an inhibitory neuron which is feeding into some other neuron, and that is inhibited, that means that the other neuron will fire more. So perhaps it'd be simpler if we just talk about Tel Arad, and then we come back to the tabernacle later.
Tell me Tel Arad. I don't know Tel Arad.
Tel Arad is this shrine that was discovered in the southern part of Israel, and it's from the 8th century BC. And this is the time. It seems to be a shrine that was around at the time of the reforms in Israelite history. So I kind of mentioned it before. It used to be a much more pagan religion in Israel. You've got inscriptions from the same time, and in fact in the same area, which say that this temple is dedicated to Yahweh and his wife, and his wife's name was Asherah. Yahweh and his wife, right? Yahweh was worshipped with frankincense. Asherah was worshipped with cannabis. You get the same in like the Canaanite religion as well. You get like Baal and his wife. So in this shrine, you have residues of cannabis, and the news went wild about this. They said, we found cannabis in this ancient temple. But they didn't really care about the fact they found frankincense. That's because they don't really know too much about pharmacology. So there were 2 altars in this hot box, small chamber, and one of them was small and one of them was large, and the larger one had frankincense residues on it, and the smaller one had cannabis residues on it. And there were 2 standing stones that were in the chamber as well, with the remnants of paint on them. So they were clearly important objects, one of them larger, one of them smaller. And it seems like there were 2 gods being worshipped at the same time, Yahweh and his wife, right? Frankincense, one of its activities is that it increases dopamine in the synapse. And cannabis, one of its activities is it increases dopamine in the synapse. The pharmacology gets a bit complicated. Without going too deeply into it, we can think of the neuronal network as a series of wires and gaps and wires, and the gaps are called synapses. So you have electrical signals, and they're traveling down the neurons, and they get to the synapse, they get to the gap, and the signal causes them to squirt a neurotransmitter into the gap. The neurotransmitter crosses the gap to another wire, to another neuron, and it starts the signal off on the other side. So it's an electrical signal which gets changed to a chemical signal, which gets changed back to an electrical signal. Is that making sense so far?
Yep.
So the cannabis, one of the components of cannabis, increases the amount of dopamine which gets squirted into the synaptic cleft. And one of the components of frankincense, which is incense acetate, keeps the dopamine in the synaptic cleft in there longer. It does it through the TRPV3 ion channels, but that's kind of getting a little bit more complicated. So what I mean to say there is that having 2 joints is not the same as having a joint and some frankincense. And obviously you can try this at home.
You're talking about in terms of strength versus the type of experience you get.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's only so much dopamine that you can squeeze out of a neuron. Yeah. But you can increase dopamine in the synaptic cleft, in the synapse, by squeezing more out, but also leaving it there for longer. And if it's there for longer, it means it's going to cause the next neuron to fire more. Yeah, because it stays there. Well, one of the things that's really interesting about this is that dopamine is connected with language production, and it's connected with ideation. And we might say broadly, putting ideas together in a new formation, which is what language production is, and which is what problem solving is. And these chambers were used for divination. The high priest or the local shaman priest would go into this place with his question for the gods. I've got a problem. And the gods would furnish him, normally him, with an answer, and he would come out and relate that to his tribe or to his people, often in verse. So, for example, Moses goes into the tabernacle, and he comes out, and he's got questions like, when do we move? Like, who do we attack? Questions about where they might find water. He goes in there and he gets told where to find water. So when he comes out, he often produces the answer in verse, which is also what you find in the shamanic traditions. You know, the shaman will go off on his own or her own with their mushrooms or their ayahuasca into their hut, and they'll spend some time with their familiar gods, and they'll come out and they'll have the answers to the questions. It might be how to heal a disease, or it might be how to where they're going to catch animals the next day. It might be a number of things. War divination was very common in shamanic. Kind of shamanic inquiry in a tribal context. So Tel Arad and frankincense and cannabis, they have a very interesting synergy at the level of the synapse, which makes them particularly strong. The chamber in which that all happened is called the dabir, and the root of that word is dabar, and dabar means word, and it also means sentence, and it also means argument, and it also means paragraph. And the root of that word actually is to put something in order, to put something in a line. So making something orderly, putting stuff together is what's meant to happen in that room. So the double whammy of increased dopamine through cannabis and increased dopamine through frankincense is really interesting in the context of problem solving, creative problem solving. And I guess another thing which is interesting to point out there is that frankincense is also anxiolytic. It reduces anxiety. And when we're anxious, we don't come up with new solutions. When we're anxious, we tend to do what we've always done. So that's why people who are smokers, for example, when they're anxious, what do? They go and reach for a cigarette. There's some really interesting research with rats. When you give them a dose of frankincense, when they're running around a maze, they spend more time in the open areas of the maze. Like generally, rats like to kind of cling to the sides and in the shadows, in the shades. That's why you don't see them very often. You know, when they're in the open areas, they're scurrying along really quickly because they know that their main predators are birds that come and pick them off in the air. Yeah. When they've had more frankincense, they're less anxious and they spend more time exploring the open areas. So if we think about that in terms of our minds, with a dose of frankincense or with any relaxing, with any anxiolytic or anti-anxiety medicine, we are more at liberty to explore the open areas and come up with solutions to the problems that we take in.
The frankincense then, so how are we taking this dose? If I want to try some frankincense with some cannabis, I can smoke the cannabis. What do I do with the frankincense?
You can chew it up about half an hour before. That's really pleasant. A old friend of mine used to always get paranoid when she smoked cannabis, and I gave her some frankincense one time. She said the paranoia didn't kick in at that time, and then again we got that anxiolytic effect. A more traditional way to do it would be to burn both of them, and a good place to do this is in your bathroom, actually, because your bathroom is pretty much a sealed chamber. So get yourself a censer and burn away and see what happens. You'll find with frankincense, it doesn't make you wonky in the same way that you might expect. Like people are expecting, acid or mushrooms to make them wonky, to make you psychedelic. So that wasn't really the point of these experiences in the Bible. The point was to open up a connection between you and your God and get information. You find that actually with ayahuasca. People who are new to ayahuasca, it makes them pretty wonky. The more familiar you get with ayahuasca, the clearer the visions get and the more manageable it is, and you're not rolling around on the floor anymore.
So you're saying the combination of the two in the biblical sense of frankincense and cannabis being together is produce a divinatory experience where they have some sort of relationship with their powerful God, Yahweh, in that case, right?
Yeah, so for example, you might take a question. You might have a question and take it into the bath, have your bath, burn your incenses, smoke if you might. You can do this without cannabis as well. You can just do it with frankincense and see what happens. And maybe you'll find an image pops into your head, or maybe you'll find an idea pops into your head, but it might not pop in with all the kind of wonkiness that you might be used to expecting from drugs.
Okay, but this holy anointing oil was not just cannabis and frankincense. There were a bunch of other stuff. They had the cinnamon, they had the cassia, they had some other stuff. They had myrrh too. Is that right?
Yeah. So the anointing oil is cinnamon, cassia, myrrh, and cannabis. The next stage of that process for the high priest was going into the chamber and having, according to the Bible, having a mixture of frankincense, galbanum, which again works on the GABA system in a different way. Frankincense also works with the GABA system. Onica, which there's various different suggestions about what it is. I think it's rock rose, which is labdanum. It's the stuff that Pharaoh used to put in his fake beard, which is one of the weirdest ways of taking drugs I can imagine. But the fumes of that are very interesting and pleasant. And then stacta, which is probably myrrh or maybe styrax. But the Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish law from around the time of the destruction of the temple, it has a bunch of other ingredients on top of that. So there's 16 ingredients in total, those 4 that I mentioned. Also myrrh, cassia again, spikenard. Spikenard's an interesting one. It's another anxiolytic, but it's also neuroprotective. And also it's called a nootropic, which means it increases your memory, your ability to memorize stuff, which is interesting in the context of cannabis, because as anyone who's smoked it knows, cannabis interferes with your short-term memory. Or your memory in general. So if you go and have a divinatory experience, but you can't remember what it was, it's no use for your tribe. So the use of spikenard would make things easier to remember. So that's another thing there. Saffron is in there. Saffron is where we get saffron from, which is related to MDMA. Costus, Caesarea costus, which is used in jostics. It's kind of recommended, it's recommended to chase the jinn away in the Islamic tradition. And then you've got other things as well. Aromatic bark, cinnamon, cypress wine, Sodom salt, and a bunch of other stuff.
So sorry, these things were not the anointing oil. The anointing oil is for rubbing on people, and this was for burning, and this was called what?
It's called the Ketoret Hasamim, or the temple incense. Yeah. So the way this was used was in this small chamber, the high priest doing it on his own, and he had a chain attached to his robe which went through the veil, so they could see if he'd stopped moving, and potentially they could maybe drag him out if he fell over, because he was in a massive cloud of super psychoactive smoke.
And that psychoactive smoke, it was cannabosum in both the anointing oil and in the incense. I forget the name.
No, but the anointing oil. So the anointing oil has cannabis in it. The smoke doesn't, but the anointing oil is not just for anointing people, it's for anointing everything. They anoint the altar, they anoint everything. So it's all over the place. And this tent has 4 different materials that it's made out of. And it's described over 5 chapters of the Bible. So it's immaculate detail, how big it is, where the pins go, so on and so forth. It's made out of acacia, interestingly enough, which is... it's got plenty of DMT in it. Although there's no direct evidence of DMT use in the Bible that I've found. There may well be there in the tradition. So one of the materials is some kind of leather. We don't know exactly what it is, but it was used to make shoes. So we know that it was something that would retain aromatic oils. So cannabis was everywhere in this tent as well.
So, okay, we have this oil. These guys were using it to conference with Yahweh, and with that being the case, they were using the incense and the anointing oil together to talk with God. Does it mean that Yahweh is a byproduct of psychopharmacology, or does it mean that the anointing oil and the incense were kind of like a pair of glasses that they put on that allowed them to change their perception to see God, Yahweh? What's your take on that?
I would say that Yahweh is a force that moves in us, or another way of putting it, that tribalism, and you see it on the streets of London, or in football stands, is a force that moves within us, and certain combinations can make it appear in an anthropomorphic form in your visions. And I give an example of this from another tradition, which is the Kala Chakra Tantra. So this is a completely different tradition, and it's the mixture of myrrh and nutmeg, right? So myrrh is one of the things in the anointing oil. Nutmeg is not, obviously, because it comes in the middle of the ocean, but nutmeg's really interesting because it contains both enzyme inhibitors and psychoactive compounds, and we're talking about L-mesine, estradiol, these other things, some of them related to MDMA. So if you, by the way, be careful with nutmeg. If you take If you take a small amount, it will just make your hot chocolate taste nice. If you take a large amount, it will make you feel stoned for days. If you get the right dose of nutmeg, it has kind of electric LSD-like effects. But if you have too much, it will give you a stoggy headache and it will be for days. So if you are interested in experimenting with nutmeg, go slowly and increase your dose slowly, because everyone's enzymes are different as well. So you're inhibiting, my enzymes are going to be different to your enzymes. Different races have different enzymes and all that. Anyway, back to the Kalachakra Tantra. It says this line, it says, when the scepter, the male organ, unites with it, their mixture is like the elixir arising from the combination of nutmeg and myrrh. From their union, a pure knowledge arises which illuminates the nature of all things. Interesting line. So there's a tantrika, Western guy, who decides he's going to mix these two and see what happens. And he doesn't know, as far as I'm aware, he knows nothing about the fact that this is quite similar in a chemical way to the anointing oil, in that it's got inhibitors and myrrh. But this is what he says. He says, awakening as if possessed by a fierce and aggressive deity, deep monstrous voice boiling out of me unbidden. Open-eyed visions and closed-eyed visions of a bulging-eyed, white-skinned man in ceremonial armour. The real world perceived as far away and through a distorted window. The window also emanated and originated a mental fireball or supernova. This fireball has as its identity the fierce deity above. My voice seemed to penetrate the walls and echo off the sky. New doors, avenues opened up inside familiar mantra, new knowledge disclosed, new perspectives on hidden meanings. So we've got that kind of apocalyptic, informational download bit, which is kind of interesting, and we often get with psychedelics. But what's really curious here is we've got this fierce and aggressive deity in ceremonial armour. When Yahweh introduces himself in the Bible, he says, I am a man of war. And he's really aggressive. He's ready to go. So I find that really curious, that particular chemical combination, or very similar chemical combination, produced something which is so similar in form with these open-eyed visions and closed-eyed visions of this war god, basically. So back to your question, is Yahweh created by these drug combinations? No, I don't think so. But your example is a good one. You know, if I don't wear my glasses, I can't see someone's face. I've got an idea that there's someone there. I can feel those. I have feelings about the fact that there is tribalism in me. There is, I love my family, but it doesn't manifest in ceremonial armour for me because I haven't hit the right dosage yet.
So, drugs in the Bible. We've done the
temple incense. We've done the anointing oil. We didn't talk about showbread. So just briefly, there's this really interesting bit from the Talmud, which I just want to share. So the showbread, again, is what most of the priests would go into the tabernacle, they'd be anointed with the oil, and then they would eat the showbread. All of these things have correlates in Egyptian religion. There's what's called the kifi, which is the incense that's used in Egyptian temples, and it's got a lot of the same ingredients. There's the mendesium, which is the oil which has a lot of the same ingredients as the anointing oil, and then you've got something similar to the showbread as well. This is what it says in Tractate Yoma from the Talmud. In Simeon the Upright's time, a blessing was sent into the Yoma, 2 loaves of bread and the showbread, and every priest who received only the size of an olive became satiated, and some was left over. So we're talking about a very, very small dose. That's not really a kind of sandwich-sized food, so they're clearly not eating it for food. But after him, these things were cursed, and every priest got only the size of a bean, and the delicate priests refused to take it altogether, but the voracious ones accepted and consumed. It once happened, one took his own share and his fellows. He was nicknamed Robber until his death. So there you've got everything that you see at a festival. You've got people one guy produces better gear than somebody else. You've got after him, these things were cursed, and every priest got only the size of a bean. So a tiny little dose doing something, and the delicate priests refused to take it. So you've definitely got some people who've said, no, I think I've had enough now. And you've also got people who are greedy, and they've had double. And then I don't know if you've got a friend who picked up a nickname at Glastonbury or something because he was a drug hoover, but this guy's got the name Robber until his death. So that's the showbread. We don't know much about it except that it contained frankincense. By the way, in the eating of frankincense, go easy. It's actually very healthy for you. It's very good for your skin. It's good for your alimentary tract. But if you have more than about the size of 2 garden peas, it might start to offend the flora in your gut. So don't bosh a whole load of frankincense and you'll get away with it, because they are drugs and they do have sensible doses and immoderate doses.
Yeah, it's certainly not something I've ever thought of as a drug. Myrrh too. I mean, is myrrh somewhat psychoactive by itself as well, or is this something just that you use with something?
No, myrrh is used. It's still used by certain African tribes that will chew a bit for their social gatherings. It was used in Roman feasts. There's an interesting documented use of it. I mean, you think about a Roman feast, they drink a load, they eat a load, they've got dancing girls, they've got all kinds of debauchery, but you only had 1 cup of myrrh wine. Because with myrrh, the right amount makes you lively, it's got aphrodisiac effects, it works on the opioid system, so it's nice, it's really pleasant. But if you have too much of it, it makes you go to sleep. One of the mixtures which also got spread around is the mixture of myrrh and frankincense. You see it obviously in the story of Jesus. That's a really interesting one. The synergy there works differently, and it's a spectacular synergy. Myrrh contains at least 3 opioid receptor agonists. If you mix it with frankincense, a series of chemical reactions happen, which basically means that the amount of opioid receptor agonist gets multiplied by something like 50. So it makes it massively more potent. You get psychoactive chemicals which aren't there in either of the original compounds but are in the mix. And you get some of the things which are in there which aren't in the original but are basically taken away by the mix. So that's another synergy which you find in Chinese medicine, for example. And again, myrrh and frankincense don't grow in China, but they've been used in Chinese medicine since at least BC.
Okay. All right. So we've got all of these different drugs they seem to be using in the Bible. They seem to be having divinatory experiences, interacting with Yahweh after taking these things in their temples and whatever. There's a much more famous story that most people have heard of, the manna from heaven that came down to sustain the Israelites in their exodus from Egypt. That sounds like a food to me. I mean, it's there to sustain them. Is that right? What's the story there?
There are 2 things that are given to the Israelites when they're in the wilderness. One of them is manna, and one of them is quails. And quails looks very much like it is used for food. And
when you say quails, you mean the bird?
Yeah.
Right.
And the other one is manna, and it doesn't actually come down from the sky. It's a secretion. The word man in Hebrew it means a secretion. For example, the Bedouin still eat a type of secretion which comes from the tamarisk tree, and it's called man. And
does it not literally say in the Bible the manna descends from heaven?
No.
Where'd that come from? Am I the only person who thinks that, or is that
no? Manna from heaven is a common parlance,
right?
But it's this idea that it dropped like food aid on Afghanistan is it's erroneous. It says in the Bible that it's there in the morning after the dew has dried up on the ground.
Okay.
So, and it's described in the following ways. It's described as a coriander seed, and the appearance thereof as the appearance of bdellium. Bdellium is a kind of resinous thing, so we know that it's in one of its forms. It's kind of pellets the size of coriander seeds, like coriander seed, white and tasted like wafers made with honey. So white resinous pellets about the size of a coriander seed. It has another form which is a fine flake-like thing, fine as hoarfrost on the ground. So that's its physical descriptions. Now, the reason I think it is ergot, which I do, is that ergot is a secretion. It's in the area. It's produced at the time. This story comes from the spring, and that's when ergot kind of comes out of its dormant period. There's actually 3 different wildernesses that the Israelites go to. In the first one, they don't find any water or any food, and they don't find any manna either. In the second one, where there's water, which means where there's vegetation, they find it. So there's another reason to think that it comes as an infection. Ergot infect various different plants, like rye, for example, famously in Europe, sorghum, and things like that. So those two descriptions, if you imagine a plant starts to secrete something gooey, it's not actually that gooey. If it dries on the plant itself, on the leaf, it would dry into pellets. If it drops onto the floor, it splashes because it's not very viscous. So it would splash and become like a frost on the ground. And if you
Is that what happens with ergot today? If we go and look in a field where ergot infested rye, that it's got a splash kind of spiderwebby sort of appearance, is it?
No, it looks more like a kind of frost on the ground. And you've got like Bedouin man, which is actually a different one. When that drops on the ground, it forms kind of globulous clumps.
And the biblical description is that it's what? It's white, it's on the ground, and
it's either like pellets, which would be how it kind of dries. Like imagine drips drying would dry into something about the size of a coriander seed, and it would be resinous and it would be white. Or if there's enough of it, it'll drop on the ground and it'll form this kind of plaque on the ground.
But they talk about it sustaining them. I mean, if it's growing on cereal crops, why wouldn't they be eating the cereal crops that are sustain them? Why would they care about the fungus infecting that cereal crop? Why would that make the Bible, but not the rye itself?
It doesn't talk about them sustaining them. The line is, at evening you shall eat meat, we're talking about quails, and in the morning you shall be satisfied with bread, and you shall know that I am Yahweh your God. So this idea of satisfaction can also refer to the feeling of, like there's a line which talks about the same word, people being satisfied with wine and with incense. So it doesn't necessarily mean having your belly full. It can also mean a kind of sense of, let's say, mental satisfaction.
But it's saying satisfied with bread. What's that got to do with manna? Is the manna mentioned there at all, or not?
Yeah, no, that's how it's referred to. It's referred to the bread of heaven.
I see. Okay, so you'll be satisfied with the bread of heaven, and that satisfaction can mean something completely different.
Yeah, and it doesn't say that the meat will satisfy them. I mean, we know that they're eating the quails because they drop and they eat them. That's not that exalted. In fact, so most people don't even know that there's quail in that story. The one that comes down to us is the idea of manna.
So what happened when they took it? When they ate this manna? What was the result? Just that they felt satisfied? I mean...
Well, it's a really interesting bit of the Bible. There's only one line in the Bible where you have synesthesia. And synesthesia is where senses mix together, where you hear sounds or something like that. Or rather, where you see sounds. And the line goes like this. And all the people are seeing the voices and the flames and the sound of the trumpet. Now, you don't normally see voices, and you don't normally see the sounds of the trumpet unless you've taken some acid. That line comes from the only collective vision in the Bible. Generally, you don't have collective visions. Generally, like a prophet will see something or they'll hear something on their own. Like Daniel sees the writing on the wall, for example. Everyone else doesn't see it, but he sees it. So it seems to be something that's going on inside his mind, or something that only he is party to. With this particular scene, it's when all of the Israelites are eating manna, and it's when Moses goes up on the mountain and he does his thing, and then all of the Israelites together, they all have this experience of synesthesia. The other interesting evidence around manna being ergot is this. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in mills or beat it in mortar and baked it in pans and made cakes of it, right? So, I mean, it raises the question, if you were an omnipotent God, why don't you just send someone a ready meal? Like, why do they have to prepare it, right? The way that you would prepare ergot to eat and be safe is exactly that. Because ergot's got two different fractions in it, depending on actually what it grows on. But normally when it grows, it's also poisonous. So it's both poisonous and psychoactive. The poisonous part is insoluble, but the psychoactive part is soluble. So the way that you would separate the insoluble and the soluble is you grind it up, you dissolve it in water, you boil it, and then you take away the insoluble part, the insoluble fraction, you leave the soluble bit, and then you bake it in a pan, you make a bunch of crystals, and you're away.
Okay.
And Moses said, let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of it left it until the morning, and it bred worms, and it stank. And Moses was wroth with them. there's not much that rots, from one day to the next in desert conditions, but ergot has a very, very rapid decay cycle. So you can't keep it very long. If you eat it at the right phase, it has the taste of honey, and that's how it's described. It tasted like wafers made with honey. If you eat it after that, it becomes very, very quickly, it becomes nasty.
So anyway, these guys were taking manna. They were having visions of Moses conversing with God and all that, the booming on the mountain, all that kind of stuff. And that seems to be an LSD-inspired experience.
Yeah, and the chemical is LSA, which is a close cousin to LSD. In fact, Hoffman made LSD out of ergot originally.
So, psychedelics in your life. You have obviously some experience with psychedelics, particularly ayahuasca. Is that right?
Yeah, I spent a long time in Brazil.
Okay. And while you were there, you were drinking ayahuasca, and you had some very crazy experiences there involving a sandfly. Is that right? What happened?
Yeah, that's right. So I went to Brazil. I was very curious about the roots of a particular lineage, Santo Daime. And that comes out of the kind of borderlands between Bolivia and Brazil, in the state of Acre. So I took myself to Acre and started looking into how it was made and all the rest. And this was after, my academic background is the history of medicine, and I've always been interested in comparative medicine, Chinese medicine, different medical theories, and all the rest. And so when I went to Brazil, I went with two very specific questions. I wanted to know about the roots of, I wanted to know more about ayahuasca, and I wanted to finish writing my book. At that point, it was one book. And I'd been there for not that long, actually. I'd been there for a few months, and I was off cutting ayahuasca as in cutting the vine in the jungle, and I got bitten kind of near my nipple on the left-hand side, and that swelled into a pimple, and the pimple just kept growing. And at which point people started telling me, Danny, you've got something really serious. That looks like Leishmaniasis, or Leishmaniasis in Portuguese. So Leishmaniasis has a couple of different phases, and it can be a really serious disease. It's a protozoal colony, flesh-eating colony, which takes up residence in your skin and in your flesh. That's one form of it. That's the visceral form, but then you've also got the cutaneous form, which attacks the cartilage in your body, so it can dissolve the cartilage in your nose and in your ears and in your throat and in your stomach. And people said to me, "Look, you're crazy."
So it's lethal.
Yeah, it can kill you. It will normally take your nose or your ears. And people said to me, "You've got to go and take injections. You've got to go and take antimonium tartrate injections." And that's a heavy metal, and antimonium, and they thought I was crazy. The area I was living in, and in fact Brazil is a highly colonized country, particularly the medical colonization of that country has been extreme in a way that it hasn't been so much in England, because we're not on the blunt end of empire, so they didn't have, for example, most of the women there give birth by cesarean section, because doctors like doing stuff to people. So anyway, people told me they would drive me around town and show me the people with no noses and no ears, and just to hurry up and take my injections. If I took my injections, it would be 3 injections every day, and if I was lucky, I'd get away with 120. If I left it for another few days, it might be 150, or it might be 210.
In total injections?
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, an injection of
heavy metal, and that stuff leads to neurodegenerative disorders down the line, all that kind of stuff.
Well, that was my thoughts. Yeah. So part of it was that I knew a bunch of people. It's endemic in the area. It's very common, that disease, and pretty much everyone treats it with injections. And I knew people who had, and one of them had joint pain, for example, because it attacks the cartilage. Antimonium tartrate attacks the cartilage, attacks your articulation. But I saw other things in people as well. The people who talked to me about it, I saw that they didn't. how do I put this? My theory of disease is a little bit different to what's popular at the moment, and I think diseases come along for a reason, and in fact all experiences come along for a reason, and we can learn something from them. And like I say, I'd gone there to learn about ayahuasca, and here I had a perfect opportunity to learn about what ayahuasca could do. But like I say, the community I was living in was pretty degraded, and they thought I was mad. So I isolated myself, and I drank a lot of ayahuasca. I wasn't completely isolated. I was under the tutelage of a curandero, a person who does cures. And I went to him and I said, I'd like to treat this with Daime, with ayahuasca. And he said, you can just treat this in hospital. And I said, I didn't come here to treat this in hospital. And he said, well, this is a serious disease and it can come back. And I said to him, well, I heard your father was a great curandero. And he took the hint and he said, okay, well, I'll treat you, but this is what you've got to do.
Why not just take the medicine? Why not just take the injections? Was it you were worried that basically it would screw up the rest of your life if you took them? The danger of that was greater than the danger of the Leishmaniasis.
I was very young. I was very idealistic. I was in my 20s. I'd asked for an experience when I went there, and I'd been drinking for a long time at that point. I'd already been drinking for 6 years before I went to Brazil, and Daime ayahuasca had filled my life with magic over and over again. I'd had inklings and intuitions, and I followed them, and stuff had happened. Wonderful stuff had happened over and over again. And it was, there comes a point in your career in magic that you just go, okay, I'm into it now. Exactly how it works, whether it's spirits or the power of your unconscious or whatever it might be. I don't know, but when I say power of your unconscious, I'm not talking about, you feel better about yourself, so you find yourself a girlfriend. I mean, bizarre coincidences happen, and you end up. The reason just a whole load of weird stuff. I won't go into all the weird stuff that happened, but I got to this moment in my Daime career where I was given exactly what I'd asked for. I want to know how powerful this stuff is, and with a background in the history of medicine, philosophy of medicine, and writing a book on the philosophy of medicine. And also it was about autonomy, it was about magic and history and a whole load of other things. I felt like I would have been unfaithful to my vision of what that book was. And what was I going to do? I was going to say no. I was going to make my book into a kind of half lie. I was going to make my life less interesting. I've always been more... I think one's will is very important. And if you ask for something and you get it and you say, actually, no, I don't want it, and the gods are giving it to you, what are you saying? So yeah.
So you put your nose and your ears and your life on the line to test whether the magic is real, basically.
Yeah, and in the process of it, I learnt incredible things. I lost 10 kilos. I lost a lot. I lost an ex-wife. I lost, what else did I lose? I had worms crawling out of my flesh on one occasion. I had to kind of pull these worms out of my wound, and it took a lot of attention. I had to clean it with special teas, but 3 or 4 times a day, special diets. One of the first things I did was I ate... I did a lemon diet, which involved drinking like loads and loads of lemon juice for 19 days, first thing in the morning. I was celibate for the whole period, which was about 8 months in total. Mostly isolated and doing a lot of praying, a lot of singing. When I went to go and collect the various different kind of tree barks and leaves that I was doing, I'd make poems to the trees as I was collecting them, and developed like a profound relationship, like firstly with my body and with how my psychology and my body interacted, because I could see the ulcer getting worse and better as I, like one time, for example, I left in the middle of a Daime session, and you're not meant to do that. You're really not meant to do that. It's bad form. And the next day it was swollen up. It was much more inflamed. Right? So I had an immediate response from my body about behaving myself, keeping myself within limits. And so the process was absolutely incredible.
So your Leishmaniasis journey ended with a cure. You came back to the UK or wherever it was, Japan, and you had kids. There's something going on with them and the Leishmaniasis at all? Or was it?
Yeah. So I towards the end of my journey with Leishmaniasis, I met a woman at a kind of retreat centre. It was a festival, in fact, a place called Fortaleza. But anyway, this woman very kindly and with a lot of love nurtured me back to health. And at this point, a bunch of other stuff was going on, but I was my visa was expired by this point. I had to get out of the country. My living situation had got pretty precarious as well for a bunch of other reasons, and we left the country. We went to Bolivia first, which is just over, like, it's, you know, you can get there really quickly over the border, and stayed a few days on a Daimi community there. And then we were in town one time, and I went to the internet cafe, and I hadn't checked my emails for a while, and so someone wrote to me saying they dreamt about me. Someone else wrote to me saying they dreamt about me. That's always significant. Somebody else wrote to me saying they just got pregnant, they're very happy. Someone else wrote to me saying that they just had a baby and they're very happy. And I wrote to a friend saying, do you think if I went home and impregnated this woman, all my problems would be resolved? And I went back to the guest house where we were staying, or the hostel, and I opened the door, and she said, shall we have a child? And I said, yes, because I'm a sucker for romantic, magical stories. So we did. That was her last period. She fell pregnant, I think, immediately. And then we went back to Brazil, and I went to introduce myself to her parents, because she was very pregnant at this point. And I'm going to tell a couple of stories at the same time here. Her brothers took me swimming in a river when I first met them, and that was lovely. There were dragonflies and fish nibbling at my very white belly, and absolutely gorgeous. Anyway, I got on very well with the family. When the kids were born, they were both born with birthmarks in the same place where I had had my wound, and I've still got that wound there. It's big. And when I went back to the Amazon many years later to show the kids off to the curandero, I said, look at this crazy magic. Like, I left a scar where I had my scar. And he went, oh, it's left a tag, has it? And he wasn't particularly impressed, because that happens all the time in the jungle. It's like a totally known thing that happens. The other part of that story is that we also went on that journey to go back to visit her parents again, and the river that I had visited had dried up. And in fact, that whole region is drying up. Desertification is a serious problem spreading across central Brazil.
Well, this leads into your relationship with Brazil did not end there. You carried on. You created some kind of NPO, NGO.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so as a result of that experience of a place I loved falling to desertification, I started working out what I could do, basically. So the first thing we did was I organised a bus for her folks and some other farmers from the area to go to an agroforestry system, because agroforestry, which is basically planting trees and crops together, is a wonderful way of improving the hydrology of an area, like improving water flow and bringing springs back to life. There was a guy by the name of Ernst Goscht, who is a spectacular agroforester. His tradition, or his technique, is called syntropic agroforestry. And he had a cacao farm which hadn't rained for decades, and he managed to get all the springs in this big area flowing again, and even made it rain again, because if you get enough trees going, they put particulate matter into the air, they cool down the area, and then the rain clouds form and they make it rain again. So, rainmaking is another one of the traditional shamanic skills. I don't know how to do it with songs, but I do know that agroforestry does it. So that was the first mission, was to take these people to the agroforestry system. The bus driver was the mayor of a town called Cachoeira. Cachoeira means waterfall, but in the 1920s the waterfall had dried up. So he asked me if I could raise money for the local school that was building a sapling, or wanted to build a sapling nursery, and had run out of money. So I started fundraising through my own network. So we built that nursery, started producing saplings. Then the next door town said, the mother of my children's town, they also wanted a sapling nursery, so we built one there, and then we started reforesting the springs in the area with kind of volunteer labour, and that kind of just continued expanding, really. There was a big urban centre in the northeast of Brazil, and they, we heard about a school there, and they said, yeah, we want a nursery as well, so we raised money for that, and then the pandemic hit, and people were going hungry in Recife, this town. So their project became an agroecology in the favela project, where they produced demonstration centres and a booklet on agroecology for the city, and that involved things like collecting water from your roof with plastic bottles, and how to make compost, and how to grow food on tiny little bits of land, anything that you can do in a high density urban slum, basically. And that was very successful. Managed to use the media from that to raise more money. That spread to 9 different poor communities in the area. We've just got that translated into Arabic, because it's also it can be used in the occupied territories, and we're looking at a partnership with someone in the occupied territories, Palestinian occupied territories as well. Then we started working with indigenous groups, and particularly at the moment we are looking at working with the Guarani indigenous nation. They've got an aldea, like a traditional village, and actually a sacred village called Nova Esperança, which is New Hope, and they want that to become the first eco-village, eco-aldea in the country. So we are currently raising money for that. So plugging my NGO here, if anyone wants to get involved, anyone wants to help, whether you're a business that's got money, or whether we've also got like schools twinning program, where we twin indigenous schools or UK schools. So get in touch. The website there is rainreforest.org.
So, to be clear, you're doing this to help feed indigenous communities that are presumably on the brink of extinction down there in the Amazon. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, so food security is part of it, autonomy is part of it. But I would put it like this, right? It's not really the project itself, which is what we do. There are black women's groups in the favela, for example, who did the agroecology in the favela project. The indigenous groups have their own projects they want to do. The schools had their own sapling nurseries they wanted to build, right? What we are, RAIN, it means Regenerative Agroforestry Impact Network. And the network itself is a place where different stakeholders, different people can come together in a like a non-hierarchical, decentralized, decolonial NGO. And what I mean by that is, if you give your money to a lot of, say, tree planting organisations, they will centralise it. They will send it off to somewhere. You might not even know where it's gone. I've talked to businesses who know they've got a tree planting project somewhere. They don't know who's doing it. They don't know what trees are going in. They don't know if they're going to end up as IKEA furniture after they've been harvested on landfill in 50 years and not sequester any carbon at all in the long run. So what we do is we get contacted by groups, community groups that want to do something, and we find people who want to help. So, for example, if you run a cybersecurity business, it's very difficult for you to directly help out an indigenous group, because it is hard working in the indigenous world. It's very hard. You've got linguistic differences, you've got massive cultural differences. For example, you work in a software company, you're going to have a schedule which is like, we want this done by Thursday. Indigenous people don't have that concept of time at all. It's completely different. If you start hassling indigenous people, we need this done by Thursday, they're like, Johnny Gringo's giving me shit again. I don't want to send you any media. So we've had this happen on a number of occasions, like both the black women's groups and one of the Guarani, for example, they didn't want to send us any media. Why? Because they've had pictures of their children put on campaigns for projects that have never actually ended up with any money for them. So we have our network is decentralized. It's community-led. Communities, that can be indigenous communities, or it can be like a business type of community. We want to help. We want to plant a bunch of trees. So we can say, well, we can help you with that. Do you want to plant, for example, the Trees and Music project? We were planting. We're just getting rid of the last ones now, which I'm very proud of. 50,000 of the trees used to make violin bows, because we wanted to bring together the classical music community and ecological projects, because basically most people are into what they're into, and there are ways of translating across borders. There are ways of translating across cultures. There are ways of finding ways through and around and under post-colonial trauma and the horrific history of abuse that's happened between people who look like me and people who are smaller and darker than me. So our network is inspired by and based on, modelled on the mycorrhizal root network and other networks in nature, because ant colonies would be another example. These resilient networks know how to share. They know how to share resources. They know how to share information. They know how to club together into a super organism.
Slime molds too, right?
Slime molds too. Yeah, I love slime molds. I cultivate slime molds. Slime molds, for example, map out space. They redistribute resources. They can predict rhythmical events, like if you blast them with cold air for 5 minutes once, and then an hour later, by the third hour, they've worked out the rhythm and they're already prepared for it. They're already retreating 5 minutes before you do it. There's something that happens when we collectivize our intelligence, which is magical, basically, I believe. Latour talks about this on a slightly different level. He says, when we have a new technology of language, of communication, then our intelligence jumps. So one example he gives is language. When we first developed language, then we could talk to each other, we could share our ideas. And then we first developed writing, so we could record our ideas. And culture jumps. And then we developed the printing press. So now we could distribute our ideas. And the culture jumped again, and you get international consciousness, and you get all that kind of stuff. The whole Protestant revolution and a whole load of stuff happens. Then now we've got this wonderful new technology of the internet, and when we're not pissing away our time on Instagram, we could be using it for fostering collective intelligence. And the case of a slime mold is a good one. When a slime molds are like bacteria who network, and they kind of wander around eating bacteria. Sorry, they're not bacteria, they're amoeba, and they wander around like eating decaying stuff. They're like eating oats. If their area dries out, they can't do much about it. They move at the space of, they're quite fast for the size they are, but they move at about 1 millimeter an hour. And if they're in a dry spot, what they do is they come together, they form something like a mushroom, and then they spore. And some of the individuals get into the air currents, and they can go and find somewhere that's more moist. Yeah. So what can I do as an individual about changing weather patterns or desert drying out places? Not very much. What can slime molds do as an individual amoeba about changing humidity? Not very much. But when they come together, they can do something. So rain is a network which is conceived to answer the question of how could the collective intelligence of a globalized network working at both local and international level respond to the threats that we are failing to meet as a species, as individuals?
It's a lofty goal. I wonder how difficult it is to get humans to break out of the individual shell and start working together collectively in a kind of new way.
I don't think it's so difficult, and the reason I say that is because the philosophy of rain is grounded in the philosophy of Kropotkin, the great Russian. He's considered the father of anarcho-communism. And when you hear the word communism, don't think Lenin or Marx. It's something quite different. So he was a guy who studied nature, and he looked first at ants. Actually, his book's called Mutual Aid: A Factor in Evolution. And it's actually an answer to Darwin. Darwin has like one paragraph somewhere about cooperation in nature, and he says, Darwin, you've got it. Yes, competition is a factor, survival of the fittest is a factor, but the fitness is also about cooperation. And for example, ants have two stomachs, and when they want to share, if an ant meets an ant who requires water, they can share from one of their stomachs water for that other ant. And he looks at different creatures, mammals, at every level, and he looks at kind of tribal customs. Like, for example, he cites a tribe where before you eat your dinner, you have to shout loudly 3 times to make sure no one's hungry around. And if someone asks you for dinner, you have to share it with them. Yeah, because you really don't want hungry people nearby, because they will rob you. It's collective, like. So what he says is that mutual aid is older than humanity. So you don't need to teach people it. And he gives examples. He says that when empires retreat, for example, then very quickly, naturally, humans start to go into collective land ownership. They start to share because it's very difficult to manage your bit of land on your own. It's much easier to hold a bunch of people. So he looks at, for example, Russian traditions of, when you've got a house to build or when you've got a harvest to do, you get everyone together in your village. They all do the harvest together, or your whatever people are around, and then you throw them a massive meal and a party at the end. And it works so beautifully because obviously the young men want to display their physical power as they're doing the planting. So when it comes to the dance at the end of the day, they can have a certain confidence in asking for a dance from the young ladies. So we work very well together. We're a collective species, and the fact that we are overwhelmed with individualism and selfishness is a very modern aberration.
Danny, there's so much I want to talk about. There's so much I want to. You're a fountain of knowledge and wisdom, and you know a lot of things. And particularly my big bugaboo, my favorite topic is apocalypse. There we go. The camera's running out. Good sign. So I love apocalypse. I'd love to talk about it. I'd love to talk about autism and ADHD and hypnosis and all of that kind of stuff. However, my face is full of hay fever. It's very late. I think it's time to stop this, and I want to pick that up with you and do another interview in the future and get into all those topics because they're fascinating to me, and we're gonna have to do that in the near future if that's okay.
Yeah, man. I reckon. How much have we done? We've done like about 3 hours. We can do another 6 next time.
And let's start earlier in the day so we can we don't fade out. All right. Danny. Oh Christ, I'm ill. All right, Danny, thank you so much for everything. This has been fascinating, and next time we're going deeper.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Luke. Thank you very much.
Arigato. All right, John, Neoka. Let's sleep.